Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight, so many things, so many different things, including everything we plan to do and a number of things which have come along at the last moment, but which demand our attention. It is, of course, first of all, and perhaps most importantly, Tolkien Reading Day. Happy Tolkien Reading Day for those of you who celebrate, which I'm sure is everyone listening to the sound of my voice right now. We also have big Tolkien movie news from an unexpected and not entirely unwelcome direction. More on that in just a moment. And of course, we're going to talk about The Desolation of Smaug, the second of Peter Jackson's Hobbit films. It is so good to be back with you all. Once again, I have Chris joining me here live in the chat. It's a bit of a ramshackle exercise tonight, but I think that we are going to have a lot of fun discussing a movie which is deeply weird, deeply conflicted internally in a way that I am only just now really beginning to chart and understand, but also not without its charm in parts. We'll talk about all of that as we go, but we are going to begin, of course, with Tolkien Reading Day. We are going to be discussing this year, in aggregate, all of us Tolkien fans, are going to be discussing the subject of unlikely heroes, which means that I have chosen a very brief excerpt. Can you really say it's self-indulgent if there is basically an international holiday organized around exactly the thing that I am about to do? I'm not sure that you can. I have chosen my favorite and perhaps the unlikeliest of all the heroes of Tolkien's work, of The Lord of the Rings in particular. I am talking, of course, about a doughty hobbit of valiant heart. I'm talking, of course, about one of the core conspirators. I'm talking about someone without whom there is no doubt Frodo could not have completed his task. I'm talking, of course, about Fredregar Bolger, also known as Fatty. I'm going to read now from my actual reading copy. As you see me here, if you're joining me live, you will see me here looking off to the side of my screen. In fact, you won't, because I do have it on a slide. I'm going to put this slide up so that you can follow along at home if you are looking at the slides, but I'm reading from my actual physical copy. There was a faint stir in the leaves, and a cock crowed far away. The cold hour before dawn was passing. The figure by the door moved. In the dark, without moon or stars, a drawn blade gleamed as if a chill light had been unsheathed. There was a blow, soft but heavy, and the door shuddered. "Open, in the name of Mordor," said a voice thin and menacing. At a second blow, the door yielded and fell back, with timbers burst and lock broken. The black figures passed swiftly in. At that moment, among the trees nearby, a horn rang out. It rent the night like fire on a hilltop. "Awake! Fear! Fire! Foes! Awake!" Fatty Bulger had not been idle. As soon as he saw the dark shapes creep from the garden, he knew he must run for it or perish, and run he did, out of the back door, through the garden and over the fields. When he reached the nearest house, more than a mile away, he collapsed on the doorstep. "No, no, no," he was crying. "No, not me. I haven't got it." It was some time before anyone could make out what he was babbling about. At last they got the idea that enemies were in Buckland, some strange invasion from the old forest, and then they lost no more time. Fear, fire, foes! The brandybucks were blowing the horn call of Buckland that had not been sounded for 100 years, not since the white wolves came in the fell winter when the brandywine was frozen over. "Awake! Awake!" Far away answering horns were heard. The alarm was spreading. The black figures fled from the house. One of them let fall a hobbit cloak on the step as he ran. In the lane, the noise of hooves broke out, and gathering to a gallop went hammering away into the darkness. All about Crickhollow there was the sound of horns blowing, and voices crying and feet running, but the black riders rode like a gale to the north gate. Let the little people blow. Sauron would deal with them later. Meanwhile, they had another errand. They knew now that the house was empty and the ring had gone. They rode down the guards at the gate and vanished from the Shire. And what is perhaps most striking about this is that this is the last we hear of Fatty Bulger until we return to the Shire and free him from the lockholes at Mickledelving at the end of the book. And here's the thing. The reason that I am citing this fabulous hobbit, this heroic hobbit, as the unlikeliest hero in all of Tolkien's work isn't just that he is heroic, but it is that he is heroic in a perfectly hobbitish manner. His character is not broken by this act of heroism. Why does he run? Because he knows he either has to run or perish. But in the moment of that choice, in the moment of that valor, he saves, I think, Frodo. And we're kind of skipping over the important part too. His chiefest contribution, perhaps, isn't even this moment of crisis, this moment of climax. It is his choice to go to Crickhollow and masquerade as Frodo in the first place, thus, crucially, dividing the forces of the enemy. There are 4 Nazgul tonight, this night, when the other Nazgul are riding to the Prancing Pony in Bree. There are 4 lingering in the Shire because they don't know where Frodo is, because Fatty is keeping up this masquerade. He is maintaining the pretense that Frodo is still in residence at Crickhollow. I think it is fair to say that if not for this quiet, unassuming heroism of a hobbit, Frodo's quest would have turned out very differently, and probably the book would be much shorter. Fatty Bulger, a true hero. That, I think, will do it for our reading. Chris, I have to know, did you anticipate my move here that I was going to choose Fatty Bulger, or were you celebratory in the chat when you said his name aloud? I'm curious whether you had... you did anticipate it. See, Chris, we've known each other long enough. I think we're very much on the same wavelength now. And Brian is joining us live too. Good evening, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us here on Tolkien Reading Day. However, that is not, of course, the only thing that we have to talk about tonight. We have to talk about the news. So late last night, over on the Warner Brothers YouTube channel, I know that you subscribe to it just like I do. It's the first thing I check in the morning when I wake up. Last night, Peter Jackson appeared in a brief 3-minute video in which he talked in very general, non-specific, and I'm going to be frank with you, not terribly reassuring terms about the upcoming Hunt for Gollum movie. It's going to be great, apparently. So we are told several times in that video. But then he does the thing that he really showed up for, which is to introduce the wonderful Stephen Colbert, announcing that after leaving his job on late-night TV this summer, having been ousted by fascists, Colbert will turn his talents to the crafting of a new Lord of the Rings movie script, the follow-up to The Hunt for Gollum, tentatively named, we know from a release from Warner themselves, Shadow of the Past. Let me share this slide with you here just so we can enjoy these 2 nerds nerding out together. Here we are. Oh, and Hugh is joining us too. Good morning to you, Hugh. Thanks so much for joining us today. So, Colbert cites in this very brief video, which if you haven't seen and you're listening to this after the fact, the link to this, of course, will be in the show notes. Colbert cites 6 chapters that the Jackson films basically excise from the original film trilogy. Chapter 3 is Company, in which Frodo makes the preparations for leaving Bag End and then finally heads off, meets with the Black Rider and then some elves and then an infamous fox. Then we have Chapter 4, A Shortcut to Mushrooms, in which we meet Farmer Maggot and enjoy a brief respite, establishing again that sawtooth rhythm of the beginning of this book before heading to Bucklebury Ferry. Then Chapter 5, A Conspiracy Unmasked, in which we arrive at Frodo's new house in Crickhollow. We get, most importantly, the Bath Song, and then we reveal that Frodo is very bad indeed at keeping secrets. Chapter 6, The Old Forest, in which we're basically barely out of the Shire and already in deadly peril. Chapter 7, In the House of Tom Bombadil, which is basically self-explanatory. And then Chapter 8, Fog on the Barrow Downs, in which, again, deadly peril is averted by the slightest margin by a guy in yellow boots. You were saying it looks like a hostage video with Peter Jackson as the hostage. I can only imagine how exhausted Peter Jackson is right now, and the pressure of The Hunt for Gollum must be significant. The pressure of managing this multi-billion-dollar franchise must be significant. But yes, he is perhaps looking a little less than hale and hearty in this video, unfortunately. As you will remember from the movies, we cut pretty quick from Frodo leaving Bag End to the Prancing Pony, right? We do a little bit of transit across the Shire, but really not that much. This part of the novel is, as Colbert notes in their video, condensed to the point of being completely unadapted, of being completely new ground. Now, let's be super clear on one thing before we even start on this. Colbert, in addition to being on the short list of greatest living Americans, in addition to being a man of great intellect and wit and care, a man who is, I think, renowned appropriately enough for being a deep thinker, as well as having his bona fides beyond unimpeachable for his position as a Tolkien fan, reader, and scholar. In addition to all of that, and in addition, in fact, let me click through my slide here. In addition to having a tiny cameo in the Desolation of Smaug, along with his sons and wife. In addition to all of these things, his reputation as a critic of Tolkien, as a thinker on Tolkien, as a fan of Tolkien, is, I believe, unimpeachable. And I believe that he is better positioned than anyone to take a thoughtful, careful, respectful swing at adapting the professor's works and simultaneously, on the other hand, preserving the integrity of the Jackson film trilogy. That said, my immediate response to this, my emotional response to this announcement is that I fear that there is too little there. I fear that if only we had some appropriate metaphor about butter and bread and the one being too much and the other being too little, setting us up for this adaptation, for this specific string of events to play out on screen while being voluntarily shackled by the Jacksonian vision, leaves us with little to go, with nowhere to go. Really, I think that my biggest concern is simply this. If this film is done perfectly, it still won't amount to much. I'm not at all sure that there is there. Let's push on and consider. I'm loath to take Colbert off my screen there, but in his role as Lake Spy, I believe he is credited as. Let's take a look at the announcement that accompanied the release of the video on YouTube in the wee small hours. This is the précis. This is the synopsis released by Warner. Obviously, this is soft. They have said that Shadow of the Past is a working title right now. We may not carry that through. And I don't know how much of this will finally make the screen. And also, let us be completely clear, this film is completely dependent on the success of The Hunt for Gollum. If The Hunt for Gollum takes a bath at the box office, then I do not think will see this film, or it will be adapted to some streaming service, or it will be cut back in some way. We will see it in a lesser form if we see it at all. It is an enormously difficult marketplace right now. Let's take a look at this précis then. 14 years after the passing of Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin set out to retrace the first steps of their adventure. Meanwhile, Sam's daughter Eleanor has discovered a long-buried secret and is determined to uncover why the War of the Ring was very nearly lost before it even began. Okay. So on the one hand, we are clearly setting the stage. It's been a little more than 14 years, but we are setting the stage for the return, I'm sure, of Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd and Sean Astin. I'm sure that we will get our existing cast back. We may, of course, bring in Sir Ian McKellen, who seems game for just about anything these days, and we may well draw back in Elijah Wood, if only in some kind of metaphorical way, right? If we can perhaps de-age him for an appearance in the past, digitally speaking, of course. And I'm excited for the potential inclusion of Eleanor. And as I say, if anyone deserves to have their fan fiction turned into a film, it is Stephen Colbert. I think that he has earned that right. But I'm not at all sure that there is the structure here to provide a really necessary film, which is what we need. There was already, I think, the sense in the discourse about The Hunt for Gollum that we kind of know where this starts and we know where it ends up. And if there's anything in the middle of real note or value, then we would have heard about it before now, right? That the connection between Circus and the Jackson films is just a little too tight. Again, this is not to say that you can't freely adapt other parts of the Legendarium. It's not to say that you can't freely adapt parts of The Lord of the Rings if you hold the rights there too. But if we are trying, as Colbert explicitly says in the video, to obey two masters, to obey the books, to be respectful and supplicative in our adaptive process of these chapters, and also to try to do the same to Jackson's vision, I'm just not sure what is there. The secret, I suppose, is enticing, right? The long-buried secret could potentially be enticing. I'm not at all sure what that is. I'm not at all sure what it's a reference to, if it is indeed a reference to anything of substance, which it may not be. So we'll see. I will be following this story, I think, probably pretty closely, just because it's rare that you see, what we called back in the day of the early days of the internet, right? A BNF, a big name fan, right? It's so rare that you get to see a big name fan really wade into the franchise. You know, it's unusual that you see someone without a well-attested history in this particular field. And I should note, too, of course, that Colbert is not writing this alone. He is co-writing it with his son, who is a working screenwriter. He's been working on it, developing the idea with Jackson, with Philippa Boyens as well. So we're very much coming from that same terroir, right? We're coming from that same space with many of the same, I'm sure, thematic and aesthetic ideas. And in this one instance, I'm not sure that concordance, I'm not sure that a completely perfect fit is the most interesting thing to do with this material. But then I might be surprised. Who knows? As I have been surprised in the course of the last week by aspects, at least, of the Desolation of Smaug. Oh, Chris is noting here in the chat, it could be good, but it won't be epic. And I think that there is space for a Hobbit-scale story told in Jackson's universe. I think that there is a space for other stories of other kinds. They can't all necessarily be end of the world stuff, right? The Hunt for Gollum isn't going to be end of the world stuff because we know at this time that the world does not end. It is going to be more of a side story. It's going to be more of a character piece, I'm sure, because it necessarily must be so. And I'm open to the idea of exploring Hobbit culture in particular, right? Ironically, Hobbit culture is perhaps the least explored aspect of Jackson's world as he presents it to us in the films, because it is our point of entry. We're just taking so much of this for granted. It's why I'm, almost despite myself, kind of charmed by the extra material at the beginning of An Unexpected Journey, right? If you see the extended edition and you have those very brief shots of baby Bilbo meeting Gandalf and of Belladonna too, right? It's so interesting to have scenes of Hobbit life in the Shire, because particularly coming from the perspective of The Hobbit, the book, there's nothing, right? We don't get a sense of Hobbit culture and community until the very end of The Hobbit, right? Famously, the auction and Lobelia. But really, it's not until we get the opening pages of The Lord of the Rings that we get a real sense of how the Shire works and how Hobbit culture is even readily identifiable. Brian is saying, I'm okay with that, despite the Rings of Power's faults. I've enjoyed watching that series. Exactly right. I think that's a really astute point of comparison, Brian. I think that that Rings of Power has demonstrated that there is actually a lot of space in the periphery. And obviously, as I've said before, that show makes some choices that I wouldn't make. And it pursues some narrative threads that I think are less rewarding than others. But they get a lot of juice out of their Second Age setting. They get a lot of juice out of the way that they have combined these elements of Tolkien's Legendarium. And I'm very open to the idea of recombining. This is essentially what it comes down to vis-a-vis the Colbert News, right? If he had come out and said, I am writing an entirely new story, this is my fan fiction, it is a side story, it is the events of the War of the Ring from the perspective of the Hobbits. I want to tell the Scouring of the Shire from the perspective of, I don't know, Gaffer Gamgee, right? That, I think, would be really interesting. It is his commitment to the Jacksonian view that I find the least inspiring about this announcement. Yeah, Elizabeth is saying in the chat, I for one would love that. I tend to tune out the orc battles and look at my phone or get a snack. I can attest that this is true because Elizabeth watched the back half of the Desolation of Smaug with me this morning and did indeed tune out and go to get a snack. Yeah. Let's, Chris is saying there's Third Age stuff that would be great for adaptation, Angmar versus Arnor. I mean, there is so much stuff that barely touches the War of the Ring. You're right. The Wars of the Kingdoms of the North, fantastic, right? The collapse of Arnor into this brawling civil war, this politically charged environment, right? With Angmar right there. That is so rich. It is so interesting. It's amazing, given the success of Game of Thrones, that we didn't try a TV adaptation of that, 10 years ago, but here we are nonetheless. There's so much stuff. It's not to say that we can't continue telling Tolkien stories or stories just inspired by Tolkien. It's just that I think this particular barrel is making an ominous scraping sound when I am ladling into it for more plot and narrative and compelling storytelling. Let's get into, speaking of which, hey, you guys, let's get into the second of our 3 Hobbit films, The Desolation of Smaug. I have described of late The Desolation of Smaug as being an interesting film. And right here on the record, I am going to commit publicly to that interpretation. The Desolation of Smaug is an interesting film. It is not a good film, not entirely, at least. There are things in this film that maybe I personally would rate as the worst things that Jackson has done on film. I think that there are things in this film which bother me at least as much as anything in the Battle of the Five Armies. Well, I'm not sure. I see now I'm just on this treadmill. Now I have to rewatch the Battle of the Five Armies. I'm going to end up in a loop with these films in exactly the same way as I wound up in a loop with the Star Wars prequels back in 2005, 2006, when I wanted to reappraise them. I wanted to return to them and just kept going through them in a cycle, even though I don't like those films hardly at all, because I would get to the end of Sith and think, well, wait, maybe The Phantom Menace wasn't that bad. I should go back and watch that again. I think I watched each of those films like 3 or 4 times in the course of a year, which I'll tell you is enough for a lifetime. What I find most interesting, hey, here I have expressed a completely unsupported point of view, an unsupported opinion on the Desolation of Smaug, and here I will try to support it. What I find most interesting about this film is its internal tension, its internal conflict, the dynamic that exists between one half of the film and the other, not split linearly. I'm not talking about the front half and the back half. It's much more complicated than that. There is this internal tension. If you strip out all of the extraneous material, if you strip out everything that is not the first pass adaptation of The Hobbit, everything that doesn't literally happen on a page of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, if you take all of that out, if you look at that story that is left, everything, as close as we get to a literal representation of what happens in the novel, if you see that as a series of charged events and conflicts, a string of pearls plot that nonetheless carries us forward with a certain amount of momentum, then you are left with something that isn't quite Tolkien, and certainly isn't Jackson, but is surprisingly close to what Philippa Boyens described as the dark fairy tale version of the story as it was originally envisioned by Del Toro. I will urge you all, if you haven't listened to my thoughts on An Unexpected Journey, skip back to that episode and listen to all of the production to and fro, all of the story of getting this film off the ground and into movie theaters. We covered that in our last episode. And what strikes me, after many viewings, what strikes me having returned to this film and really tried to figure out what works about it and what does not work about it, is that if you strip out everything that is extraneous to the story of The Hobbit, you are left not just with a fairly propulsive plot, but you are left with a visual and stylistic coherence. There is something that threads those sections of the film together in a way that leads me to attribute them to the work of Del Toro, right? Based on aesthetics and experience and some small slivers of detail released by Del Toro, by Jackson, by Boyens, by Fran Walsh, by other members of the production team, right? There is a sense in which the core story here is still the Del Toro vision of this film, and it has been interrupted, quite often literally interrupted, by Jackson's pursuit of his corporate mandate to tie this trilogy of films now more closely into his Lord of the Rings universe in order to secure, frankly, the financial futures of MGM and New Line. Because consider, for example, right, this version of Mirkwood and this version of the Woodland Realm and this version of Lake Town in particular, this version of Erebor, if you strip everything else out and you tighten those things up, you are left with something that doesn't quite feel like Tolkien, that isn't quite representative of the books, but does feel like a piece of art, that does feel like a story that has been considered holistically and arrayed thus, that these elements haven't been chosen at random. There's no internal conflict, I think, in those sections of the story. They fit together rather beautifully, rather organically, rather naturally. I think that there is a consistent and evolving tone carrying us through the heart of this film. Again, it's not always successful and it's not always to my taste, but it does work on its own terms, I think. It's not, as I say, the book, but if you set the book aside and you look just at the text as it appears on screen, particularly if you look at it as a series of stills, right? If you were just analyzing the production design, if you're analyzing the work that has gone into the pre-production process here in particular, I think that you can see a continuity between Mirkwood and the Woodland Realm and Lake Town. I think you can see a continuity between Beorn and Thranduil and the Master of Lake Town and even ultimately Smaug, even Bard, honestly. In Jackson's vision, Lake Town feels weird and Dickensian and Baroque and ill at ease. In Del Toro's vision, it feels weird and Dickensian and Baroque and ill at ease, except intentionally so. It fits better with the material around it if you strip out the material that does not quite fit this story. Contrast this with Dol Guldur, right, which is a striking set piece for sure, particularly the version with Thrain in the extended edition. We're only, of course, going to be talking about the extended edition, although I will note, I mentioned in our last episode talking about An Unexpected Journey that It is perhaps arguable that, okay, let me take a half step back. It is certainly arguable, and indeed I will argue it, that the extended editions of the Hobbit trilogy are less essential than the extended editions of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I still generally think that the extended editions are worth the price of admission. I already mentioned the scene with young Bilbo bumping into Gandalf, and our faintest, briefest glimpse of Belladonna Took, for example. All extended edition, very worth it. I'm not sure the same is true for the Desolation of Smaug, you guys. I'm not sure that what the extended edition adds makes the film stronger, because I do think that the extended material amplifies, magnifies the internal tension, the internal resonance, this destructive echo that is happening inside the superstructure of this film. We'll get to all of that, but I wanted to talk a little about Dol Guldur and talk about how the aesthetics of this expanded material, of Dol Guldur, of the Tombs of the Nazgul, right? There is clearly an aesthetic regime at play here. There is clearly a real sense. There is artistry here. It's just a different kind of artistry. It's desaturated, and it's flinty, and it's crowded, and it's the contrast seems higher, right? The whites are whiter and the blacks are blacker. It's got this flinty quality to it that I can't quite reconcile with the other parts of the film. And I'll note here too, for the record, that I'm not talking about quality exactly. Let's be very clear on that point. I'm not saying that Del Toro made or conceived a better film than Jackson. That's not what it is about. It is about internal consistency and the way that the film speaks to and through itself. Lake Town makes more sense on its own terms per Del Toro than it does in the Jacksonian mold as an echo of Bree, particularly in the extended edition, of course, where we begin in Bree. Let me open up a slide here where we can see our boy Thorin here in the Prancing Pony, because what we're doing here very specifically, very consciously, is replicating the atmosphere and the aesthetic of Bree as it is presented to us in the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Jackson is following this mandate from New Line to make these films feel more like The Lord of the Rings. And he does this by literally making this feel like The Lord of the Rings. This is Bree as we meet it in the Fellowship of the Ring. But what it fails to acknowledge, what it fails to respect, and what it crucially fails to communicate to the audience is that Bree feels like that in the Fellowship of the Ring because that is what Frodo is feeling. Bree is terrifying and chaotic to hobbits who have just left the Shire. They've just been through this traumatic sequence of events, even without Fatty Bulger helping out back at Crickhollow, right? We've been through this difficult journey, this difficult transition, and now we are in an alien world that feels gigantic and leering and overwhelming and ominous. We get all of the camera angles and the sudden intrusive close-ups as we get into the Prancing Pony back in that first film, all of which are terribly effective because we are in Frodo's POV. Bree isn't Mos Eisley, right? Like, the Prancing Pony is not the Cantina. This is not a dangerous place. It makes no internal sense if it is fundamentally a dangerous place. And certainly, there's nothing in the book that tells us that Bree is fundamentally dangerous, that it is occupied by, that it is itself a wretched hive of scum and villainy, to coin a phrase. Here, though, at the beginning of this film, in this extended edition, we are slavishly recreating the spirit of the earlier scene to little or no effect. And it's not just a question of aesthetics, though it is crucially a question of aesthetics. It is also structure, because it's one thing to shore up the story of The Hobbit with expanded material, to draw in all of the work found in the appendices and to really fill out the world, to build around it. But it is quite another to pay lip service to that process. It is quite another to invoke the proper nouns without following through on the ideas. The Tomb of the Nazgul, for example, is a hollow drum. I mean, sure, they're there. The Nazgul, I guess, are out in the world now, but where is the consequence within the frame of this film? Why are we doing this? Why are we taking this prolonged and, let's be clear, expensive detour in the course of our film in order to allude to something that is not present and will not influence the shape of this film or the subsequent film in any way whatsoever. A more compelling example of this, of course, would be Thorin's father, Thrain, who is so necessary to the film that he's entirely absent from the theatrical cut. He returns in the extended edition in order to deliver some cryptic and irrelevant exposition and to gesture vaguely toward a threat posed by the Lonely Mountain, but not to articulate it in a way that gives us any forward momentum, not in a generative way that gives us additional conflict or leverages dramatic irony to keep us in our seats or to stop us from looking like Elizabeth at our phones. He's just there to take up time on screen, to fill a spot in the story. He invites us, he all but demands that we speculate about the nature of this conflict, but there is no greater substance there than was initially clear. And perhaps the most baffling example of all of this is the dual casting of TV's Sherlock, TV's favorite Sherlock, one of TV's top 3 favorite Sherlocks, Benedict Cumberbatch, as both Smaug and Sauron. And I say baffling because the film is clearly, if inconsistently, drawing together, comparing the threats posed by the dragon and the necromancer. We are getting these gestures towards some kind of symmetry, some consonance between these two, and casting the same actor for both parts demands our attention, just like Thrain, right? It demands our attention. It demands that we speculate about the connection between the two, and there's nothing there. There's no thematic depth to be found. It is drawing lines on a graph. It is connecting Polaroids on a corkboard with red thread to no ultimate effect. I think that Cumberbatch is pretty great in this film, honestly. I think his performance as Smaug is extremely decent, bordering on the great. I think that he is delivering a really, really solid performance. His performance as the Necromancer is much harder to pin down, honestly, just because there is so much less of it. But I think the manifestation of the Necromancer is effective. It is visually compelling. It does generate a few questions about how readily Gandalf sets aside the events of this film in order to, return to a relatively quiet life for the next 60 years while Bilbo just hangs out in the Shire with his ring. But, we kind of have points of compatibility failure all the way around this trilogy of films and the Lord of the Rings trilogy too. So that is, in some ways, my biggest appreciation of this film, and my biggest problem with the film is simply that what is good at its core is kind of bad Tolkien, right? Like, it's a kind of free-form adaptation by Del Toro here at the heart of this story, but at least it works on its own terms. The rest of the adaptation is much more faithful to the core text, or is much more interested in appearing faithful to the core text. And by core text here, I guess I am combining both the previous trilogy of films and the established Tolkien canon too. But it works far less well on its own terms. We have to shoehorn in this awful double flashback structure right at the beginning of the film, right? We get the meeting in Bree 1 year ago when Gandalf meets Thorin for the first time. And within that, flashback again, completely unnecessarily, once more to the Battle of Azanulbazar, so that we can meet Thrain by extension. It doesn't really work. It stalls before it has even left the blocks, and that is a real problem. And you'll remember, if you did listen to the last episode where I was talking about An Unexpected Journey, how much I praised the beginning of that film, because while it is slow, while it takes its own sweet time, there is joy there, even in the framing device, right? I talked last time about how my heart caught in my chest the first time that I saw Frodo, the first time I saw Elijah Wood at the beginning of that film, because I didn't know he was going to be there. Contrast that, the warmth of that, the interconnectedness of that, with this perfunctory. I think perfunctory is the best word. With this perfunctory bit of framing at the beginning of the Desolation of Smaug. Let's gloss the structure of the film as I glance nervously at the time. We're doing just fine. Let's gloss the structure of the film, and then I think we can get into some specifics. So we begin with this 7 minutes of double flashback, right? A flashback within a flashback in Bree at the Battle of Azinul Bazaar, effectively introducing Thrain and his whole subplot. Then we cut to the wilderness. We intercut some bad guy action, kind of catching up with where they are now after the end of the first film. We spend then almost 20 minutes with Beorn, right? This is our first feature segment in this film. If this film is, as The Hobbit is often described as being, kind of a string of pearls plot, then this is the pearl that occupies us for the first segment of this film. Beorn, who inexplicably chases Thorin and company in bear form into his own house, and is then astonished by their introduction, which largely mimics the sequence in the book without, crucially, any of the charm. I think that this film puts a catastrophic foot forward. I think that the first 10 minutes of this film, 15 minutes of this film even, are very poor. I don't think that the flashback sequence works, and I don't think that our introduction to Beorn, who I think really kind of comes around in his very short appearance in the film, I don't think that the introduction to this character works. Let me call up a slide here of Beorn so that we can enjoy this crazy cinematography. This is one of the stranger things about it. This sequence, particularly this opening sequence, but really the whole Beorn sequence, is shot with a deliberately, consciously weird frame style, right? We are cropping closer. We are closer into these characters. It's not just Beorn, although it is most notably Beorn, but we also get some weird close-ups on Gandalf through the sequence. These are uncinematic pieces of framing. This is TV procedural close-up, right? This is for something that you're not even really watching, but you need to see every flicker of emotion on this character's face so that you can follow their elementary emotional journey. That is what we are getting from Beorn. And as you can see here, this looks kind of badly composited. And I wonder how much of this was shot long after the fact. I'm wondering whether there was a completely different version of the what we might think of as the Queer Lodgings introductory scene, right? The introduction of the dwarves, or if that was skipped entirely. It would make more sense, honestly, given that Beorn does, as I said previously, chase them into his own house. It would make more sense if, or at least that scene would make more sense if we then didn't follow it up with the traditional per the text introduction. I'm not at all sure how to fit these two things together. But again, right, we're adding material in and it isn't fitting. It is dissonant in a strange way. So as I say, Beorn starts pretty bad, but gets much better. His scene with Gandalf at the end of this part of the film is really solid. And I think that the two of them talking together without the comedic interruption of the dwarves is the good kind of Tolkien reference here, right? It is the good kind of, we exist in a larger world, don't we? It's the best kind of allusion to lore, although that is not to say that some of the lore isn't, I mean, wildly confusing, right? Some of the lore is borderline baffling because he says that he was here when the Dark Lord ruled this area and that he is the last of his kind. That's 3,000 years, y'all. Like, is Beorn effectively immortal? If Beorn is effectively immortal, how do we account for his absence in The Lord of the Rings? Like, he just naturally lives for an incredibly long period of time and then happens to die between here and there. That seems unfortunate, to say the least. So after Beorn, we get into, if this is the first pearl on our string of pearls, we get to our first feature pearl immediately thereafter as we teleport. Thank you for these teleporting ponies, Beorn. They get us to the edge of Mirkwood in a cut, a single transition. We are suddenly there at the edge of Mirkwood. And here we really see, I think, some of the division in the film because Mirkwood feels fully realized. And at the same time, as we are beginning to explore it, as we're beginning to get a sense of this forest, its visual representation, its thematic representation, we also have Gandalf scrambling in the background, trying to establish his own subplot so that he can go off to the northern moors and investigate these tombs. So, as I say, we do 20 minutes in Mirkwood with the spiders before we are rescued/captured by the elves. And there are some things here that I think really work. The Mirkwood stuff in general is not completely to my taste, right? But I do see a lot to love in this disorienting, trippy kind of dark fairy tale atmosphere. The spiders don't completely work. I'm thrilled that we get Attercop. I like the way that we handle their speech. I like the way that Bilbo's transit into the ring vision, into the Wraith world, kind of connects him to these creatures, and he can understand their language, albeit briefly. It is pretty harrowing, honestly. The effects work through here is not just compelling and convincing, but is cohesive too, right? It all feels like it is generated from the same core set of ideas and principles. What really works for me is the immediate precursor to the still that you can see here on the slide in front of you. Bilbo killing the strangely pale, cute-coated spider, right? I don't know what that is supposed to be, but I understand from the rules of cinema and aesthetics that it is coded to be cute and harmless, right? And Bilbo goes to town on it. He kills it savagely and then reclaims his ring, and we get that brilliant turn from Freeman, all done in an extended one-er. You'll notice this if you go back and watch it again. It is Freeman navigating the internal emotional complexity of a character with no dialogue. Absolutely none. He just communicates this. I guess the last word that we get is mine, right? As he takes the ring back from the spider that neither had it nor wanted it, presumably. He takes it back, he claims it. It is this Gollum-like moment, and then he realizes what he has done. Martin Freeman's face is perhaps more capable of communicating that central idea, what have we done, than any other, which makes the last line of the film so strange and extraneous. I don't think that we need him to say it because it is right there filling your IMAX screen right in front of you. And of course, well, this is one of those moments, right? This is one of those moments that stands, a few moments in this film that stand between the two interpretations that I've offered here as a means of understanding the internal tension in this film, because Bilbo being consumed by the ring is both an excellent Tolkien idea and a great dark fairy tale idea, right? The idea that the lure of this thing is too great, and he understands in that moment that the power that it offers, the thing that is kindled within him because of it, is too much. It is too big. It is unhobbitish. That is tick, 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 all the way across the line, right? It works in every thematic paradigm that we have. It works from every perspective that we have. Except perhaps the Bilbo that we meet at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, who is very cozy with his little magic ring in his pocket. So he's going to relax about this ring, I guess. But here in this heightened state, heightened because of Mirkwood, heightened because of this hallucinatory environment in which he finds himself, heightened because of aggression and combat and fear, in this moment he connects to the darkness of the ring in a very direct way that, as I say, works for me thematically from basically every perspective. From there, we get captured. I don't have anything to say about Orlando Bloom in this film. I wish that I did, almost. And when I say that I don't have anything to say, this is not to be taken as, either damning with faint praise or that I am biting my tongue and withholding terrible caustic criticism of the man and his performance. I really have nothing to say about Orlando Bloom in this film. He is there. He sure did show up for work and stood in front of a camera and did a lot of motion capture and, submitted to whatever cosmetic de-aging process they also coupled with their digital de-aging process. There are a couple moments where it looks really good and a couple moments where it absolutely does not, but that's to be expected for a film of this very specific vintage. My larger problem here is that Legolas doesn't fit this story. We have to pinpoint the very simple emotional arc that he performs in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but we also can't begin it, because if we begin it, there will be no explanation for his reset at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. We just have to highlight in stasis all of these character qualities that are going to be resolved when we get to his real story. I completely understand the temptation to include Legolas in this film. I don't know that I would be strong enough myself to resist the urge to include Legolas in this film, but I think that he ought not perhaps to have been included, or that he ought to have been given a different kind of story, because we end up just holding him still, unfortunately. I would contrast that, of course, with, if we're going to spend 15 minutes in the Woodland Realm and then we're going to spend 10 minutes on a barrel chase and then we're going to cut all over the place for the rest of the film, it does at least give us the opportunity to talk about an unsurprisingly controversial character. This, of course, is Evangeline Lilly as Tauriel. And I am going to court that aforementioned controversy by saying this. Tauriel is, broadly speaking, great. I think Tauriel really works. I think that any readings of Tauriel that do not account for her very specific and non-generalizable storyline here, right? Her particular position in Thranduil's court, her particular position vis-a-vis Legolas, her particular position vis-a-vis certain dwarves. These things are a combination of specific character details, which is impressive. It is not easy, I am sure, to wade into Tolkien's world and think, well, I just have to make up like what, one more elf? I can totally make up one more elf. The bad faith reaction to Tauriel online when this movie came out and in the aftermath of this movie's release, I think it will surprise you not a jot, I'm sure, to learn that it is rooted primarily in a particularly and peculiarly, rank kind of misogyny. We do not like seeing female characters. We do not like seeing new female characters who are introduced who are competent in exactly the same way that men are competent. See also Rey from Star Wars, right? Rey doesn't do anything that other male characters haven't done before her. Tauriel doesn't do anything that Legolas doesn't do in this film, but for some reason we judge these new original female characters so much more harshly for reasons which I'm sure will not be a surprise to anyone. But apart from that, separating out that, looking at Tauriel as she appears on screen, looking at the performance from Evangeline Lilly, who I think, is one of the inarguable brightest points in Lost, a show that I absolutely adore, a show that I defend greatly. I think that her performance as Kate is so much more complicated than people generally recognize it to be. I think that in the common critical response to Lost, a lot of excellent character work gets shaken out, and these characters are reduced to archetypes, to stereotypes. That happens too here. Evangeline Lilly is not playing an elf. She is playing Tauriel, this person with a history and with wants and desires and with a perspective on the world that extends beyond her thematic role, extends beyond her role in this interesting kind of conflict with Thranduil that is mediated by Legolas. And I will say too, since I'm praising Evangeline Lilly and her performance as Tauriel so much, let me also praise the performance of Lee Pace as Thranduil, who I think is also just fantastic, just theatrical, right? So keyed into what he is doing. I think that there is a quality to Lee Pace's performance that can come off as being reductive, as being cartoonish, as being like a pantomime. See people who critique his performance as Ronan the Accuser in Guardians of the Galaxy. He is giving a great performance in Guardians of the Galaxy, a movie that I do not like very much, right? But I think that he is also playing the specifics of his character with much more care than, for example, Orlando Bloom is playing the specifics of Legolas, right? The specifics of Legolas are insubstantial, but the specifics of both Tauriel and Thranduil are rich and complex and internally tense. They have internal lines of division and combination, I think. He says Evangeline and Orlando were included in the movie to appeal to the female audience members. That is a fairly kind of well-attested criticism from the time. I'm not sure that I would agree with either of those. There are, as we discussed when we were moving through the book, very few elven characters. We needed, effectively, particularly if you're going to structure the back of the story in the way that Jackson et al. Have wanted to structure the story, right? We want these simultaneous arenas of conflict. We want the battle at the mountain, but we also want the battle at Lake Town, right? Which we'll get to in 20 minutes or whatever. If you want to have characters active in all of those spheres, you need other characters. If you want to generate tension between Legolas and his dad, you need someone there to provide a perspective, to provide a bit of grit around which the string of pearls here, right, this plot can form. And frankly, Jackson is in an impossible position. If he introduces another elf who is a male character, then he is going to be roundly criticized by the internet for doing so, right? It is a real and legitimate problem with The Hobbit that there are so few, with Tolkien's work in general, right? But specifically with The Hobbit, that there are so few female characters. This is an opportunity to add a fantastic female character. And I'm not sure even that I would say that if these characters were added, right? And this is always like a reductive, speculative kind of process to go down the road of but why were these specific decisions made? Unless you have, kind of pretty well attested accounts from the people involved saying, I had to do this because my boss said if I didn't do this, I was going to be fired, right? If New Line weren't happy with the job that Jackson did, he wasn't going to get to make more movies for New Line, is exactly where we are here. But even if it's true that I don't think that Orlando Bloom was recruited for this series of films to attract a female audience. I think that the audience of The Lord of the Rings wanted to see more Legolas. Legolas is an incredibly popular character across the board. As I've said before, have never really gotten it. Not in the movies, not in the book. I'm not a Legolas guy, but that's fine, right? I understand that people are going to want that moment of recognition. They're going to want that glamour shot when he turns and does that little half smirk that he does, and suddenly we're all caught up. We're feeling the good feelings that we had back when we were watching The Lord of the Rings, particularly with this mandate to make this trilogy more like that trilogy. But I think that even if Tariel is included to provide representation, to provide a female character for the little girls who go and see the Hobbit trilogy in movie theaters to find aspirational, to look up to see themselves reflected in, I think that's a good thing. I think that it's worth doing, particularly. Okay, let me phrase it this way. I think that it is worth doing well. I don't think that just this stock, I think what everyone was expecting when it was announced, right? Particularly after the backlash to Lost had already happened. I think that the thing that people feared Tariel would be destructive to the film, right? If she were just a placeholder character, it would be bad for the film because bad characters make bad films. That's how that math works out. But I do think that the specifics of Tariel are very effective. Now, having said all of that, the romance doesn't work. The romance just flatly does not work. It doesn't have enough time. It doesn't have enough juice. Unfortunately, all of the specifics that we can find about Tariel's character are absent from our plucky, heroic, good-looking young dwarf. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit as we move forward, I think. Or maybe we won't. Maybe that's enough just to say it is that I don't think the romance works hardly at all. It could have. I'm not opposed to it conceptually, and God knows every time we cut to Evangeline Lilly for a reaction shot and her eyes fill up, I'm almost in that moment convinced, right? I'm almost in that heartbeat. I think, wow, wait, no, this romance is terrific. And then, of course, it's insubstantial. There's not enough time for them to generate. A very brief conversation about Starlight and his mom isn't quite enough to get us there. Tariel, greater than Keely, says Elizabeth Stevens. And I am completely inclined to agree. It's not even the fault. We talked about the dwarves the last time. It's not even the fault of the performance. The problem is there are too many dwarves. And in trying to differentiate every single dwarf, we end up differentiating basically none of the dwarves, right? And we don't get a lot of extra differentiation in this film. We'll talk a little more about that as we move forward. So post barrel ride, can you believe we're skipping all the way past the barrel ride? My least favorite part of this film, and possibly, again, I need to go and watch the Battle of the Five Armies again. The barrel ride sequence might be my least favorite thing that Peter Jackson has made in his career. Frankly, I think that it is so over the top, and yet because we are so constrained, it just loops. It is just this recursive series of suddenly an arrow, suddenly a leap, suddenly a sword swing, the dwarves passing improvised weapons back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for, I don't know, an hour and a half of my mortal human life. Just does not do it for me. It is physically implausible, right? The actual physical mechanics, the buoyancy of the barrels doesn't seem to be right at any point. I didn't even think to make a note about the awful, bomber rolling off in his extended set piece with the camera swinging drunkenly to and fro as he takes out, 40 orcs. And this is much more important, I think. The way that we are encouraged to celebrate the death and dismemberment of all of these orcs. We are supposed to be cheering the death of these orcs in a way that we are never invited to cheer the death of any orc in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The tone here is so different. Which is fair, because The Hobbit has a very different tone to The Lord of the Rings. But what the difference between the books is that The Hobbit is represented as children's fiction. And this is not. This is not a sanitized, bowdlerized, less, violent version of Middle-earth. This is, if anything, a more violent, more superheroic version of Middle-earth. We're just encouraged to laugh at it rather than think about the consequences of it, which I find tough. Cartoon physics, as Chris says here. Yes, absolutely right. So, post-barrel ride, we skip out to the tombs of the Nazgul and Gandalf's conversation with Radagast, who is really... it seems unfair to say it. And I like Sylvester McCoy's performance well enough here. I think I like his performance here better than in the first film, actually. But it does seem very clear that Radagast is only there, very much, out of his natural milieu, very much out of his natural kind of domain of power and influence and knowledge. He's only there so that Gandalf has someone to talk to, right? If Gandalf had like a cute little animal, some kind of Disney talking animal companion, I don't want to give anyone ideas at this point, but if Gandalf had literally anyone else that he could talk to, we wouldn't have, I'm pretty sure, Radagast in those scenes. We then introduce Bard, the Bargeman, later the Bowman, later Lord of Dale, and boy howdy, it's a pretty great performance, I have to say. I think that in general, the performances in this film are really quite good. Some of them are misaligned and put to ill purpose. For example, the wonderful Stephen Fry as the Master of Lake Town, I think fundamentally does not work. But he is performing the thing that he has been asked to perform with a great deal of gusto and enthusiasm, as you would expect from Stephen Fry. But where the great performances come in and line up with the material, Thranduil, Tariel, certainly, and crucially here with Bard. This Bard who manages to straddle the line between this roguish anti-hero, right? This like rebel leader of man, and also the rightful heir to the throne of Dale, or the lordship, the rule of Dale, and also manages to inhabit this space as the grim-voiced man from the book, right? He is also Bard as we meet him in the book, before Tolkien even really understands who he is. He manages to do all of these things, and I think is just terrific. Again, the core performances, just fantastic. So we meet Bard an hour and a quarter into the film, which roughly ends our first act. And I know you're thinking, hey, this podcast has been an hour already. Don't worry, we're going to accelerate. We've hit a lot of the big points that we've already hit here. But we conclude that first act, right? Wood and Wild, in effect. From here, we're into Lake Town, and we're into the beginning of the second act, a little over half an hour, as we establish how Lake Town works, the aesthetics, our new cast of characters as we move into this phase. Then we hit the midpoint of Act 2, the midpoint of the whole story, by splitting the party, sending everyone but Fili and Kili and Owen and Bofer onto the Lonely Mountain. Interesting addition here, right? That Owen is the doctor of the party. We're getting some small pieces of development here, but we could have done that before, and really he doesn't serve any purpose, because it turns out that all we need is Athelas. Again, we're going to do this whole thing. Dot is saying here, I do kind of dislike a gritty live action adaptation of The Hobbit in concept. I kind of wish the Hobbit films were much more different aesthetically from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Personal favorite Hobbit adaptation is the 1970s Rankin Bass animated film, but that may be due to nostalgia. If I'm honest, not entirely sure it's actually very good. It's almost impossible to break the Rankin Bass down in terms of good or bad. But you're absolutely right, Dot. What it is a I'm trying to think of verbs that are less aggressive than like a brawling, striking, forceful, intrusive kind of aesthetic statement. It has such a sense of what it is that it can't help but work on its own terms, right? And either you are on board with that or you are not, but it is a bold statement, and it is much less this conflicted in-between that we find here in the Hobbit trilogy. That's a really great point. And Brian said a few moments ago, I think that attempting to duplicate the Gimli-Galadriel relationship here makes that relationship less extraordinary. I think that I would agree. In Potentia, yes, absolutely, Brian. I think you've alighted on something very important there. It's kind of a cursed object, though, right? Because if this relationship were better, if this relationship worked, then it would maybe detract from the Gimli-Galadriel. Because for me, this one doesn't really have the juice. I still love the Gimli-Galadriel as much as ever I did. So here maybe we're blessed with the fact that it doesn't quite line up with our elf dwarf romance here. And of course, the relationship between Gimli and Galadriel is so much more than that. It's so fascinating that in both trilogies, we get these really interesting, intimate, profoundly intimate relationships with Galadriel, and yet neither is particularly or is explicitly romantic, right? I think that is so unusual and bold and fascinating, just endlessly fascinating. I love the intimacy that we get, as I mentioned, I think in the last episode when we actually saw them together on screen. The intimacy that we get between Galadriel and Gandalf is beautiful. Absolutely beautiful and completely consistent with what we know of Galadriel from the earlier / later texts. So I just wanted to wrap with one thought here on Lake Town. I'm struggling to articulate exactly what it is that I find so incongruous about Lake Town, while respecting its position in the Del Toro version of the story, right? In this Dickensian borderline steampunk vision of Lake Town, I think it works on its own terms. It does not, for me, make sense as a part of the Jackson aesthetic, right? I was thinking that what? Rohan is 700 miles away, maybe 600 miles away. Gondor is like the same kind of distance, 700-800 miles away to Minas Tirith, right? Can we believe that this lake town exists in the same world as Minas Tirith, as we saw it in the Lord of the Rings trilogy? Can we believe that you could conceivably travel from this lake down to the Golden Hall of Methuseld in Edoras, right? I just don't think that I can make that cognitive leap. I just don't think that I can process the contradiction between these two aesthetics existing within the same world. But maybe that is a limit to my imagination. Maybe that is a limit to my ability to integrate these very different aesthetic perspectives on the content. We then intercut the three strands that are in play at this point, right? We've got the Dol Guldur adventure on the one hand, we've got the mountain on the other, and the lake town on a, theoretical third hand here that we have, until Bilbo figures out the secret door and goes inside, whereupon we get maybe the high point of the film, very, very probably the high point of the film, an uninterrupted 10-minute sequence between Bilbo and Smaug. And it is, kind of weird to think about this being Watson and Sherlock. If you were a big fan of the BBC Sherlock, as I believe we all were legally required to be back at the time of its initial release, and similarly, I think we have all kind of dulled in our appreciation of Sherlock just a little bit over the years. I went back to it years ago. In fact, I went back to it, oh my goodness me, 6 or 7 years ago, and found that there are maybe 3-4 good episodes of Sherlock, and the rest are not at all so much, actually. But still, those 3 or 4, very well worth having. And the performance here, I just think, is great. Both performances. Again, Freeman doing so much with his face, with his body, with the things that he chooses not to say or is prevented from saying in a specific moment. He is able to articulate such emotional depth and complexity and internal contradiction in a really great way. Brian saying, yikes, Bilbo is a bit too close to Smaug's mouth. I don't want to nitpick, right? That is never like my chief goal in these discussions is to nitpick. I do feel that Smaug's size is somewhat inconsistent through the course of this entire sequence. I do feel that he is occasionally, presented as being immense, which is a really strong, good, positive choice. But he is sometimes more immense than others. I feel like there are certain shots where he is of a conceivable size, of a measurable size. You could understand the dimension of this dragon. And then there are other shots where he is just this eldritch force, where he is just this unshaped being out there. And I'm not sure that those all work completely well for me. So meanwhile, while this is going on, and is, as I noted in our previous discussion, another example of Jackson's adaptive process giving us so much more of the book than we really had any right to expect. There's so much more here, directly taken from the text. When we get to Barrel Rider, right? When we get to I Come From Over Hill and Under Hill, there's so much, all of Bilbo's, names. We don't get Clue Finder. Sadly, that was excised for time, I'm sure. But we get so much of that back and forth, and it's so effective. Even the way that we're using the ring through this sequence, that Bilbo's suspicion of it and reliance on it, and Smaug's, this is for me, I'll asterisk this, the most successful part of this film's implicit desire to connect Smaug and Sauron, right? The fact that Smaug can sense the ring. He knows that Bilbo is carrying something, and he knows that it is gold. There is something triggering to him there. Now, of course, it might just be part of the dragon sickness, part of, his desire for gold is, after all, well, at least ostensibly what started this whole endeavor. There's a lot of retcon in this film as we kind of unpick some of the assumptions that we brought into the first film based on the book. For example, the Arkenstone. The role of the Arkenstone, the importance of the Arkenstone. Retroactively, here at this relatively late hour, we make sense of the dwarves' entire plan. The ridiculous treasure hunt that we talked about when we were reading the book in the first place, and even talked a little bit about in our discussion of An Unexpected Journey. This ridiculous idea that one burglar can go into the mountain and come out with all the treasure of Erebor, right? Even before we start talking about recovering our home. The Arkenstone now offers a solution, because it really is, as we speculated last time, a token of rulership. If you hold the Arkenstone, you can summon all the armies of the dwarves. If you can summon all the armies of the dwarves, we are led to believe, you can slay Smaug and take Erebor back. So it makes sense after the fact, but it is a retroactive justification of something that is flawed, I think, in the original concept of, that is incomplete in the original concept of the book. This goes all the way back to Tolkien's original writing. It was supposed to be a treasure hunt. It didn't go any further than that. It is a later retcon that as Smaug points out in the pages of the book, of course, that how are you going to do this? What are you going to do about ferrying it back to wherever you came from, paying taxes and avoiding robbers, that kind of thing. It's really interesting in this moment, though, that in a similar way, we connect Smaug to the ring. I wish we had more of it. I do personally, I think, wish that we had more of it. I really like conceptually the idea of comparing, of overlapping Smaug and Sauron. It's unclear exactly what the nature of that relationship is. It's unclear exactly what the relationship of those identities are, particularly when you have Cumberbatch performing both parts in not dissimilar ways, quite frankly. I'm not sure how to unpick all of that. We don't get enough of it here to speculate. But if I had to choose between, I think, more of that or less of that, I think I would choose more. I think that's a really interesting way to go. And then we're done, right? That's it. Then the film just falls apart. It falls into exactly the kind of previs, high adventure, superhero movie, special effects extravaganza for the last 30 minutes of its runtime. Bard is imprisoned. Thorin is having big feelings. Then we have the action sequences. Lake Town is attacked by Bolg and his orcs. We get the running battle with Smaug within the Lonely Mountain. We get the Golden King. We get that whole... We get, again, to mimic Chris from earlier, right? Cartoon physics. Convection does not exist. As long as you can be a hair's breadth away from molten gold and you will not burn, because heat is restricted to the substance itself. Thorin can absolutely bellyboard his way down this rivulet of molten gold without any ill effect, which is, frankly, a testament to his high constitution score and some really lucky rolls by his player at the table, I'm sure. It just doesn't work. I don't think it... The one thing I am grateful for here, he said somewhat hesitantly, drawing this whole discussion to a close. The one thing I am grateful for is that at least the Golden King, this statue of Thror, right, which is itself such an evocative idea that in the height of his madness, on the brink of the destruction that his dragon sickness would lure to Erebor, his greatest act of narcissism, of self-celebration, of greed and of desire is to construct a gigantic solid gold statue of himself. It's there is something there that does have some juice to it. It is kind of a big thematic swing. Unfortunately, it kind of looks like garbage. The whole sequence here just kind of does not look very good at all. And ultimately, of course, is bound to be counterproductive, is bound to be anticlimactic because we know where the story is going. It doesn't end here. It ends at the beginning of the next film, which we will see in just a couple of weeks' time. And as I say, I don't need the last line, but I do think that Martin Freeman is very effective at communicating the horror of what has been unleashed now. Kind of fits together. But yeah, a little bit inconsistent and a little bit, really primarily, I think, not what I am looking for here at the end of this film. So let's, we're 10 minutes over time. We're exactly where we want to be. Let's wrap this thing up and talk a little about our schedule, because we have some announcements to make. Next week over on Stars and Swords Footnoting Genre Fiction, we're going to begin our 15th unit, a long-awaited look at the work of a modern master, one of my all-time, like top 5 favorite authors, Terry Pratchett. We're going to be talking about his 4th Discworld novel, a generally accepted starting point for one's exploration of the Discworld for this kind of endeavor. We're going to be talking about the novel Mort. Because we are going to do some brief background work on the life of Sir Terry and his gigantic and complex and varied and challenging and brilliant body of work, because we're going to do some of that biographical stuff at the beginning, it will be a short reading. Unfortunately, Terry Pratchett doesn't use chapters, so it's a little bit harder, and there are so many different versions of this book, in different paperback, different hardback, different digital versions. It's really tough to say, we will go to page 130, or we will go to this particular point. So instead, I'm going to give you plot points here so we can figure out exactly where we are going to go. Read until Mort has finished his first night on the job, and the King of Stolat is dead. You will know it when you get to it. When you get to it, stop reading, because that's all we're going to do. It's about 20% of the way through the book. I think we're going to take 3 episodes to cover all of Mort, which is just going to be such a delight. It's going to be so fun to delve into the works of Pratchett. As I say, just an unbelievably brilliant writer. Mort isn't even my favorite book of his, but it is a really great starting point. So we'll be able to talk about death and the metaphysics of the disc. We'll be able to talk about the power of belief. We'll be able to talk about how magic works in this brilliant world, and how Pratchett navigates his urge toward satire and leavens it with this incredible humanity, an enormous empathy from just a brilliant writer. Then, April 7th, believe it or not, we will be back here with Shy Reckoning for our concluding thoughts on the Hobbit trilogy. We will be looking in depth at the Battle of the, don't forget the, it's very important, 5 armies. We'll be counting armies for about an hour. I think we'll try and figure out the math on that altogether. We will then, no break, right? We'll return to Stars and Swords the following week to continue our discussion of Mort, and then whatever 2 weeks after April 7th is, mathematicians have yet to figure it out, but I'm sure that they're on it and working very hard. Whatever the next episode of Shire Reckoning is after that discussion of the Battle of the 5 Armies will be the beginning of our discussion of Beren and Luthien, the single volume, the collated volume published by Christopher Tolkien. It is a great book. We're going to be talking about Beren and Luthien specifically. We're also going to be talking about the halo of influences around that book and how Tolkien arrives at his ideas of heroism and of love and of these 2 indelible characters. It's going to be such a fantastic discussion. I know I said I was going to put up a poll, but I also know the emails that I've received over the course of the last week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks even, and I know that the appetite is raging. So we don't need the formality of a poll. We're just going to go ahead with Beren and Luthien. And hopefully, I think it is a slender volume. There is a lot to talk about. I think I'm anticipating 4 or 5 episodes. We'll see how we go. And then hopefully around that time, we'll be able to talk about returning to our regular weekly production schedule. But hey, you didn't hear it from me. We'll see how that all works out. Guys, thank you all so much for joining me tonight. Brian's saying that he was the only vote for The Color of Magic. Brian, I like The Color of Magic too. I understand why people don't so much. It is a heavier lift. It is a harder climb to get to The Color of Magic. You need to have your Conan and your Jack Vance like at your fingertips, I think, in order to readily appreciate the object of Pratchett's satire there. But yeah, it is a tougher sell certainly than the other books. I was hoping for Guards. Guards is my favorite. Sam Vimes is my single favorite character in maybe all of fiction. I don't know. I'm feeling very Sam Vimesy now for reasons which I'm sure don't need to be explained to any of you. But yeah, Mort is a really great, gentle middle ground to introduce us to the disc and introduce us to what Pratchett is doing in those books. So all of that coming up within the next few weeks. That's March 31st for our first discussion of Mort, and April 7th for The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. I know both of those are Tuesday nights, and I'm doing so far a bad job of sticking to Tuesday nights, so do stay tuned if you're listening to the podcast version of this show and you would like a little more forewarning about when these episodes are going to happen. If you would like to join me live, in fact, for this discussion, if you would like to join Chris and Dot and Brian and you and Elizabeth, is that everyone tonight? I think it is, but I think that you know, these numbers are variable. People pop in, people pop out all the time. If you would like to join us here for these live discussions, head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. You can sign up for free and you will get notifications of these live sessions. Usually, 12, well, 12 is maybe optimistic, but 9, 10, 11, 12 hours before they happen, you will get an email notification so that you can find your way here and join us in our common room here as we discuss the great works of Tolkien. That is going to do it for tonight, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for your patience. I will see you all again, I hope, next week or in 2 weeks for the Battle of the Five Armies. Until then, do please take care. Good night, all.